45 historical events were buried for decades, their human cost ignored and erased from history. But the truth can't stay hidden forever. Behind every forgotten story is a life destroyed by silence. Families, communities, and entire nations left to suffer without recognition. In this video, we uncover the events history tried to forget and the devastating toll they took on the people who lived through them. Prepare for the shocking truths you've never been told. Chapter 1. The St. Louis Disaster. In 1939, the MS St. Louis, carrying 937 Jewish refugees, fled Nazi Germany, desperately seeking asylum in the Americas. They thought they had found safety, but the US and Cuba rejected them. Denied entry, the passengers had no choice but to return to Europe, where many would face certain death in the Holocaust. But this was more than just a refusal for refuge. This was a death sentence for many, and the world didn't even blink. The ship's passengers were caught in a cruel game of politics, their lives weighed against international tensions. The tragedy was buried, erased from the history books for decades. The lives lost, the families torn apart, gone without a trace in mainstream history. The St. Louis was remembered only as a footnote, its survivors left to carry the trauma without justice. But what they didn't know was that this disaster wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first in a long line of forgotten human suffering. But this wasn't the only time lives were traded for political gain. Another group would soon be denied refuge, and their fate was even darker. Chapter 2. The Tulsa Race Massacre. In 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma was home to Greenwood, a prosperous black community known as Black Wall Street. But that all changed when a false accusation sparked a horrific massacre. White mobs descended on the district, burning businesses, looting homes, and killing hundreds of black residents. What followed was a brutal erasure of the community, leaving survivors without justice or compensation. But the massacre wasn't just about the destruction, it was about silencing an entire people. The massacre was buried by the media, and the few who survived were forced to live in silence, their grief ignored. For decades, the world looked away. The true scale of the tragedy remained hidden in the shadows of history, leaving generations of survivors to suffer in the dark. The lives lost, the dreams shattered, gone without a trace. The story of Black Wall Street was silenced, but not forgotten. But what happened in Tulsa was not unique. Another community, targeted and destroyed, would also be swept under the rug. Chapter 3. The Khmer Rouge Genocide. Between 1975 and 1979, under the rule of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia became the scene of one of the worst genocides in history. Led by Pol Pot, the regime executed nearly 2 million people, almost a quarter of the population, forcing countless others into brutal labour camps. But what was even more terrifying was the world's indifference. The global community turned a blind eye as families were torn apart and entire villages disappeared. The survivors of the killing fields were left in the shadows, their trauma ignored. For years, their voices were silenced, and their pain buried under layers of political upheaval. The scale of the genocide was staggering, yet it remained largely forgotten, overshadowed by other conflicts of the time. The survivors were left to rebuild their lives without recognition, their suffering dismissed by history. But the truth could only be suppressed for so long. But Cambodia's nightmare didn't end there. The remnants of another hidden war, this time in Southeast Asia, would soon come to light. Chapter 4. The Secret War in Laos. From 1964 to 1973, the United States waged a covert war in Laos, dropping more bombs on the country than during all of World War II combined. This secret war was aimed at stopping the spread of communism, but it came at a devastating cost. Thousands of innocent civilians were killed, and the land was left littered with unexploded ordnance. But what made this war even darker was its secrecy. The US government kept the bombings hidden from the public, leaving the people of Laos to suffer in silence. The survivors, many of whom were children, lived in constant fear of landmines and unexploded bombs. For decades, the world knew little about the destruction. The war's human toll was erased from history, and the survivors were left to rebuild their lives without recognition or help. But what no one realised at the time was that the legacy of this hidden war would continue to haunt Laos for generations. But Laos was not the only victim of a hidden war. Another country's suffering would soon be exposed, a tragedy no one ever saw coming. Chapter 5. The Magdalen Laundries. For over 150 years, the Magdalen Laundries in Ireland operated under the guise of rehabilitation. Thousands of women, labelled fallen by society, were sent to these institutions where they were forced to work in harsh conditions. These women were often punished for crimes as simple as being pregnant, out of wedlock, or for simply existing outside societal norms. But the cruelty didn't stop there. The women endured emotional and physical abuse, their lives completely controlled by the church. They were forced into near slavery, their stories erased from the public eye. The laundries kept their secrets hidden, and for decades, the world did nothing. When the truth finally began to surface in the late 20th century, it was too late for many of the women who had lived their lives in silence. The victims had been ignored for so long, their pain buried beneath the walls of these institutions. But the Magdalen Laundries were not the only place where women's voices were silenced. There was another story, darker still, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. Chapter 6. The Stolen Generations of Australia. Between 1905 and 1967, Australian authorities forcibly removed thousands of Aboriginal children from their families. These children, known as the Stolen Generations, were placed in white foster homes or institutions. The government claimed it was for their welfare, but the reality was far more sinister. They were stripped of their culture, their language, and their identity. For decades, the pain of these children was ignored. Many of the survivors grew up in harsh, loveless conditions, with no connection to their heritage. The stories of these stolen children were buried under a blanket of silence and shame. Even when the truth began to surface, the Australian government downplayed the scale of the trauma, leaving survivors to live with the emotional scars alone. The removal policies were finally acknowledged, but the damage was done. But Australia wasn't the only country to destroy the bonds of family for political gain. A similar horrifying story unfolded in the US during this same period. Chapter 7. The Lost Battalion. In 1918, during World War I, the 77th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Lost Battalion, found themselves trapped behind enemy lines in the Argonne Forest. Out of contact with their command, they were left to fend for themselves, surrounded by German forces. Despite desperate attempts to communicate and call for help, no rescue came. The soldiers endured days of starvation, injury and death, yet their sacrifice was largely ignored by the history books. The Lost Battalion's survival against impossible odds was nothing short of heroic, but the world's focus remained on the larger battles of the war. When they finally returned, there was no recognition, no celebration. Their bravery was overshadowed by the overwhelming tragedy of the war. The men who survived were left to carry the weight of their experience, forgotten by all but those who had lived through it. But the Lost Battalion wasn't the only group to be abandoned during a war. Another group of forgotten heroes was about to experience even greater horrors, and this time, no one would even know they existed. Chapter 8. The Destruction of Rosewood. In 1923, the small, thriving black community of Rosewood, Florida, was destroyed by a violent white mob. The tragedy began with a false accusation of assault, and the town was soon reduced to rubble. Black residents were killed, homes burned, and survivors forced to flee. But what followed was an even darker betrayal. No one talked about it. The massacre was silenced, swept under the rug by both the local government and media. The few survivors who managed to escape were left without justice or recognition, their lives scattered in the wind. For years, the tragedy was buried by a culture of denial. The descendants of Rosewood's victims struggled to find closure as their community was erased from the historical narrative. It took nearly 70 years before the story resurfaced, but by then, the pain had already festered. Rosewood wasn't the only community to be destroyed in silence. Across the nation, there were others, one of which was forgotten until the very last moment. Chapter 9. The Greek Pontian Genocide. Between 1914 and 1923, during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, over 350,000 Greek Pontians were systematically killed or forcibly displaced from their ancestral lands. This genocide, like many others, was shrouded in secrecy, with the world looking the other way. The Greek Pontians were forced into death marches, many perishing from starvation, disease and violence. Entire villages were wiped off the map, but their suffering was buried under the weight of geopolitical change, and their stories faded into the background. The world's indifference to the atrocities committed against these people meant that justice was never served. Survivors carried the trauma of being erased from history. For decades, their suffering went unnoticed by the larger world. Yet, the silence surrounding the Pontians was not unique. Other communities, too, suffered genocides that were ignored by the global community, their histories buried for far too long. Chapter 10. The Battle of Attu. In 1943, during World War II, American forces fought to recapture the Aleutian Islands in Alaska from the Japanese. The Battle of Attu was brutal. Soldiers faced freezing temperatures, treacherous terrain, and fierce opposition. The battle was costly, with hundreds of soldiers killed, yet the world's attention was focused on larger, more publicised Pacific battles. The soldiers of Attu were left to remain in the shadows, their sacrifices unnoticed by most of the world. What followed was years of silence. The survivors returned home, but their valour was overshadowed by more famous victories, and their struggles went unrecognised. The toll of the battle was felt deeply by those who fought, but the larger public paid no heed. The men who fought at Attu were forgotten, their names lost in history. But the heroes of Attu weren't the only ones left forgotten. On another battlefield, an even more harrowing and overlooked story was about to unfold, leaving its survivors with nothing but scars. Chapter 11. The Executions. During China's Cultural Revolution. Between 1966 and 1976, during China's Cultural Revolution, millions of intellectuals, artists, and perceived enemies of the state were persecuted, publicly humiliated, and executed. The government's call for ideological purity led to mass executions, and families were torn apart in the name of revolutionary justice. But the most insidious part was the silence that followed. As the world looked on, China's government downplayed the scale of the atrocities, and the victims' voices were silenced for years. The public torture and execution of intellectuals became normalised, their lives reduced to nothing more than political scapegoats. The victims were erased from the historical narrative, their suffering ignored as the country moved forward, leaving scars on the families that would last a lifetime. Their stories were buried under the weight of communist propaganda, and for decades, the world failed to recognise the true human toll of the Cultural Revolution. But China wasn't the only nation to use its people as pawns. Another country's destructive silence would soon be revealed, and its cost would be just as great. Chapter 12. The Partition of India. In 1947, British India was divided into two nations, India and Pakistan, creating the largest mass migration in history. Millions of people were displaced as the border was drawn, and over 1 million lives were lost in the violence that followed. But what's often forgotten is the personal suffering. Families were torn apart, entire communities destroyed, and the pain of loss remained unspoken for decades. The brutality of partition was erased from the official narrative, overshadowed by the political birth of two new nations. The survivors carried the trauma of their forced migration, yet the full scale of their loss remained hidden. The true cost of partition, the lives destroyed by violence, the families ripped apart, was kept out of public view for years, leaving generations to silently mourn the losses that history tried to forget. But the horrors of partition weren't confined to India. In other parts of the world, entire populations were displaced with even less recognition or regard for their suffering. Chapter 13. The Spanish Flu. In 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic killed more people than World War I, at least 50 million. The virus spread rapidly, devastating communities around the globe. But what followed was even worse. Silence. The pandemic's scale was minimised and the suffering of its victims was brushed aside. While governments focused on the aftermath of the war, the real horror of the pandemic was ignored. Families were destroyed, and entire communities ravaged by a disease that was forgotten almost as quickly as it arrived. The survivors carried the trauma of the virus for years, but their suffering remained largely unacknowledged. The Spanish flu, despite its staggering death toll, was buried beneath the shadow of global recovery. The virus vanished from the history books, and the survivors were left to rebuild in silence. But the silence surrounding the Spanish flu wasn't the only epidemic to be forgotten. Other pandemics would strike, and their toll would be just as catastrophic, though even less acknowledged. Chapter 14. The Hiroshima Survivors. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, An estimated 140,000 people were killed instantly, with many more dying from radiation sickness. But the survivors, known as Hibakusha, endured a different kind of suffering, one that would last a lifetime. The world saw the bomb as the end of the war. But for those who lived, it marked the beginning of a horrifying, silent journey. The pain of radiation burns, the loss of loved ones, and the psychological trauma were compounded by the world's indifference. Hibakusha's stories were often minimized in the aftermath, and their suffering remained largely unacknowledged. The survivors were left to grapple with the long-term effects of radiation, while the government's silence created an atmosphere of isolation. Their fight for recognition went unheard for years. But Hiroshima's survivors weren't the only ones carrying the scars of war. Another group, subjected to even more inhumane treatment, would soon reveal their own painful story, a story lost in history. Chapter 15. The Cambodian Killing Fields. From 1975 to 1979, Cambodia was ruled by the Khmer Rouge, a communist regime that executed nearly 2 million people in a brutal attempt to create a utopian society. The regime's genocide is now recognised, but for years, the world remained unaware of the scale of suffering. The Cambodian people were forced into labour camps, starved and slaughtered. Entire families were wiped out, and cities were emptied. But the true horror was the silence that followed. The world's attention was diverted, and the survivors were left to suffer in isolation. For decades, the Khmer Rouge's atrocities were swept under the rug, and it wasn't until much later that the survivors began to share their stories. Their pain, hidden for so long, was finally heard, but at a tremendous cost. The Cambodian genocide was far from the only unrecognised tragedy of the 20th century. Another genocide, just as devastating, had been silenced for years, but it was about to be uncovered. Chapter 16. The Black Wall Street Massacre. In 1921, the wealthy black community of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was destroyed in what became known as the Black Wall Street Massacre. White mobs, incited by a false accusation, looted, burned, and killed with impunity. Hundreds of black residents were killed, and thousands lost everything they had built. But the true devastation wasn't just in the lives lost, it was in the erasure of an entire community. The massacre was barely reported in the media, and the survivors were left without justice. They were forced to rebuild their lives in silence, with no recognition of their suffering or their loss. For decades, Black Wall Street's destruction was buried under a veil of indifference, with survivors' stories ignored and their claims for reparations dismissed. The community's resilience in the face of overwhelming hatred went unnoticed by most of the world for years. But Tulsa wasn't the only town to be obliterated and forgotten. Another massacre, just as horrifying, occurred, and its victims were also silenced for decades. Chapter 17. The Silent Tragedy of the Bataan Death March. In 1942, more than 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were forced to march 65 miles in brutal conditions after the surrender of Bataan in the Philippines. The Bataan Death March became one of the most horrific events of World War II. The prisoners, already weakened by battle, endured relentless heat, dehydration, and abuse. Thousands of men died during the march, either from exhaustion or at the hands of their captors. Yet, after the war, the suffering of those who survived was largely ignored. For years, the survivors' stories went unheard, overshadowed by the larger battles of the war. The US government did little to recognise their sacrifice, leaving many veterans to struggle in silence. The pain of the Death March lived on in the memories of the men who survived, but for decades, their voices were silenced. But the Bataan Death March wasn't the only unsung horror of the Pacific Theatre. Another forgotten atrocity, even more horrific, had yet to be uncovered. Chapter 18. The Forgotten Genocide of the Herero and Nama People. From 1904 to 1908, Germany's colonial forces in present-day Namibia carried out a brutal campaign against the Herero and Nama people. Forced into the desert, the Herero were slaughtered, and the Nama suffered similarly under a genocidal policy. Over 80% of the Herero population was killed, and the Nama were decimated as well, their lands taken over by colonial forces. The survivors were left to suffer without recognition or aid, as the German government denied the atrocities. The Herero and Nama genocide was hidden from the world for decades, overshadowed by other global conflicts. Even when the truth came to light, the survivors received no reparations, and their suffering was largely ignored. The scars of this genocide lasted long after the survivors died, leaving the community's pain buried beneath the weight of historical denial. But the Herero and Nama genocide was not the only instance of a colonial power attempting to erase a people. Another forgotten genocide would soon be revealed, one that remains largely unknown today. Chapter 19, The Massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane. In 1944, during World War II, the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in France was massacred by Nazi forces. The villagers, including women and children, were rounded up, separated, and then brutally killed. The town itself was burned to the ground, leaving only ruins. But the true horror wasn't just the massacre, it was the silence that followed. The world learned of the tragedy, but the full scale of the destruction wasn't recognised for years. For survivors, the trauma was compounded by the lack of justice. The Nazi perpetrators were held accountable, but the wounds of the massacre lingered long after. The villagers of Oradour-sur-Glane were denied a place in the broader narrative of wartime heroism and sacrifice, their stories buried beneath the weight of war's brutality. But Oradour-sur-Glane wasn't the only village to fall victim to Nazi cruelty. There were other massacres, forgotten, suppressed, and erased, one of which had even darker consequences. Chapter 20. The forced relocation of the Japanese Americans. During World War II, the US government forcibly relocated and interned over 120,000 Japanese Americans in camps, fearing they might aid Japan in the war effort. Families were uprooted from their homes, their businesses destroyed, and their lives reduced to nothing more than suspicion and paranoia. The internment camps were places of suffering, harsh living conditions, lost freedom, and shattered dreams. Yet for years, the story of their suffering was erased from history. The government downplayed the trauma, and those who were affected struggled to find justice. The lives lost in terms of opportunities, and livelihoods went unacknowledged for decades. Even after the internment was declared unjust, the survivors received little compensation, and their pain remained largely forgotten. But the internment of Japanese Americans was just one part of a larger pattern of forced displacements during wartime. Another group, displaced and forgotten, would soon demand to be remembered. Chapter 21. The Massacre of the Taiping Rebels. Between 1850 and 1864, the Taiping Rebellion raged in China, led by Hong Xiuquan, who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. The rebellion, one of the bloodiest in history, left an estimated 20-30 million dead. But what followed was even more disturbing: the massacre of its survivors. After the fall of the Taiping capital, Qing forces executed thousands of captured rebels, and civilians who supported the movement were systematically slaughtered. The horrific violence was largely forgotten by the outside world, and the pain of the survivors was buried under the political turmoil of the time. The mass slaughter was minimized in history books, and the descendants of the Taiping victims carried the weight of this forgotten tragedy. Their fight for justice and recognition was silenced, and the true cost of the rebellion was lost to history. But China's darkest moments were far from over. Another wave of brutal repression was about to take hold, and this one would have a global impact. Chapter 22. The Enclosure Movement. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, England's enclosure movement saw the forced consolidation of common lands into private hands. Peasants who once relied on these lands for survival were pushed off, losing their homes, their livelihoods, and their way of life. The laws behind the enclosures favoured wealthy landowners, leaving the poor with nothing. Thousands of rural families were displaced, some forced into squalid cities in search of work, while others were left to starve. The injustice of the enclosures was ignored by the rich and powerful, and the suffering of the displaced was buried by history. The enclosure movement was a quiet, yet devastating form of social and economic violence, leaving generations of people in poverty. Yet for centuries, this suffering was not acknowledged until the full scope of its impact was uncovered. But the enclosure movement wasn't the only time the wealthy turned a blind eye to the suffering of the poor. Another devastating story of forgotten displacement was about to be unearthed. Chapter 23. The Forgotten Wives of the Victorian Era. During the Victorian era, women were often confined to their roles as wives and mothers, their lives governed by societal expectations. But the real tragedy was in the lives of those who suffered silently behind closed doors, enduring abuse, neglect, and the crushing weight of social norms. Victorian women had few legal rights and were often forced to stay in abusive marriages for fear of scandal or social exclusion. They had little power to speak out, and their suffering was ignored by society. As the years passed, these women's stories were erased, their pain forgotten by history. The social constraints of the time made their lives invisible, and the emotional toll of living in constant oppression went unnoticed for generations. Their struggles remained buried beneath layers of societal expectation. But the silence surrounding Victorian women's suffering was not unique. Another group, subjected to similar oppression, would soon rise up and demand recognition. Chapter 24. The Loss of the USS Indianapolis. In July 1945, the USS Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese submarine after delivering parts of the atomic bomb to the Pacific island of Tinian. Nearly 900 men were left stranded in the ocean, fighting for survival against sharks, dehydration, and the elements. Only 317 survived, but the tragedy didn't end with the sinking. For days, the Navy didn't even realise the ship was missing, and the survivors were left to endure unimaginable horrors. When they were finally rescued, many of the men suffered from severe psychological trauma, but their plight was largely ignored for years. The story of the Indianapolis was buried, overshadowed by other events of World War II, and the survivors were left to carry the trauma without recognition. Their bravery and suffering went unnoticed for decades, hidden in the shadows of a forgotten disaster. But the disaster of the Indianapolis wasn't the only tragedy to be hidden away by the government. Another story of silence and neglect was unfolding at the same time, one that had even deeper implications. Chapter 25. The betrayal of the Kurdish people in Iraq. In the 1980s, under Saddam Hussein's brutal regime, the Kurdish people in Iraq suffered unspeakable atrocities. In 1988, the regime carried out a series of chemical attacks on Kurdish villages, killing thousands in what is now known as the Halabja massacre. But the horror didn't stop there. The Kurds were subjected to systematic genocide during the Anfal campaign, in which villages were razed and their people forcibly displaced or executed. The world's response was minimal, and the suffering of the Kurds remained largely unrecognised for years. The international community failed to act, and the survivors were left to rebuild their lives under constant oppression. Their voices were silenced, their pain ignored, until the world could no longer deny the magnitude of the genocide. But Iraq wasn't the only nation to betray its own people. Another group, suffering at the hands of its government, would soon rise to demand justice, though their story was also buried for years. Chapter 26. The Silence of the Indian Mutiny. In 1857, Indian soldiers rose up against British rule in what became known as the Indian Mutiny, or Sepoy Rebellion. What started as a military revolt quickly spread, turning into a full-scale uprising. Thousands were killed, and entire villages were ravaged by both British and rebel forces. But the rebellion was swiftly crushed, and its aftermath was devastating. The British response was brutal. Villages were burned, and hundreds of rebels and civilians were executed. The entire narrative of the mutiny was distorted to paint the British as saviours, while the suffering of the Indian people was erased. For years, the sacrifices of those who fought for independence were buried beneath colonial propaganda. The heroes of the rebellion were erased from history, their courage forgotten by the world. But India wasn't the only place where colonisers silenced resistance. Another struggle for freedom, equally heroic, was about to be buried under even more brutal oppression. Chapter 27. The Nazi experimentation on prisoners. During World War II, Nazi doctors performed horrific experiments on prisoners in concentration camps, experiments that caused unimaginable suffering and death. Prisoners were subjected to chemical, biological, and medical testing, with no regard for their well-being or humanity. These experiments were kept secret, buried under the chaos of the war. The victims were often tortured beyond recognition, and many died during the experiments. Their suffering was dismissed as necessary for scientific progress, and their pain was erased from the public consciousness. For years, the truth about these atrocities was suppressed, and the survivors, left with lifelong physical and emotional scars, were denied justice. The medical community even tried to erase their pain, dismissing the horrors of Nazi experimentation as isolated incidents. But Nazi experimentation wasn't the only brutal injustice to be ignored. Another medical atrocity, just as horrifying, was carried out in secret, its victims' stories left untold for decades. Chapter 28. The disappearance of the lost colonists of Roanoke. In 1587, a group of English settlers established a colony on Roanoke Island in North Carolina. When a supply ship returned in 1590, the entire colony had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only the word Croatoan carved into a post. The fate of the lost colonists has remained one of history's great mysteries. Some believe they were killed by Native Americans or lost at sea, but the true story has never been uncovered. The silence surrounding their disappearance only deepened as no one was ever held accountable for their fate. The mystery of Roanoke became buried in speculation, with few serious investigations into what really happened. The colonists' stories were erased from history, leaving behind only a haunting word and an unanswerable question. But Roanoke wasn't the only colony to vanish without a trace. A darker mystery, hidden in the records of another lost settlement, was waiting to be uncovered, one with even more chilling implications. Chapter 29. The Displaced Armenians. The Forgotten Genocide. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire began the systematic extermination of the Armenian people, forced marches, mass killings and starvation. Over 1 million Armenians were murdered, and the world turned a blind eye. The Armenian genocide is one of history's most horrific tragedies, but for decades, the truth was buried. The Turkish government denied it, and the world allowed the atrocity to be swept under the rug. Survivors were left without recognition, their trauma ignored as they struggled to rebuild their lives. For years, the Armenian people fought for their history to be acknowledged, but the genocide remained a dark secret. The silence surrounding the mass killings denied them the justice they so desperately needed. But the Armenians weren't the only people to face genocide. Another group, suffering similar horrors, was about to find their story suppressed in much the same way, buried by political interests. Chapter 30. The Spanish Inquisition's Hidden Victims. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, targeted Jews, Muslims, and suspected heretics within Spain. Thousands were tortured and executed in the name of religious purity. The Inquisition's methods were brutal, using fear and terror to suppress dissent. But what's often forgotten is the vast number of innocent people who were targeted, not just for religious reasons, but for their ethnicity, beliefs, or even personal grudges. The victims' stories were erased from history, buried under the weight of religious and political motives. For centuries, the Inquisition's crimes were minimized, the pain of its victims ignored. The true scope of its horrors remained hidden, leaving survivors to suffer in silence. Their stories were lost to time, overshadowed by the Church's influence and political agendas. But the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition were not confined to Spain. Other parts of Europe would soon face similar waves of persecution, and their victims would remain forgotten. Chapter 31. The Irish Famine. Forgotten Suffering. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland was ravaged by a potato famine that killed over 1 million people and forced another million into exile. While the Irish starved, the British government did little to aid them, and the response from London was callous. The Irish famine wasn't just a natural disaster, it was compounded by neglect and mismanagement. The British government's failure to act exacerbated the crisis. Yet this was largely overlooked by the wider world. Survivors of the famine were left with nothing, and many were displaced, living in misery with little to no help. For decades, the suffering of the Irish people was overshadowed by British imperial interests. The famine's true toll on the Irish people remained hidden, and their pain ignored as the world moved on. But Ireland wasn't the only nation to suffer under colonial neglect. Another tragic story of starvation and suffering was hidden in plain sight, its survivors left to bear the weight of injustice. Chapter 32. The Sacco and Vanzetti Trial. In 1920, 2 Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, were arrested and charged with robbery and murder in Massachusetts. Despite scant evidence and widespread support from the public, they were convicted and executed in 1927. The trial was a travesty of justice, tainted by xenophobia and political bias. Sacco and Vanzetti were condemned not for their crime, but for their political beliefs. Their execution sparked protests worldwide, yet their story was buried by the powers that be. For decades, the injustice suffered by Sacco and Vanzetti was ignored, their fight for fairness lost in the noise of political conflict. Their legacy was only fully recognised years later, when the truth became undeniable. But Sacco and Vanzetti weren't the only victims of political persecution. Another group, targeted for their beliefs, would soon find their suffering equally ignored, until the truth broke through. Chapter 33. The Trial of the Black Panthers. In the 1960s and 70s, the Black Panther Party rose up to challenge systemic racism and inequality in the United States. But the party's members were targets of political repression, with the FBI using illegal tactics to undermine and imprison them. Many members were unjustly convicted, their lives destroyed by a government intent on silencing their movement. The trial of the Black Panthers became a symbol of racial injustice, but their fight was buried under media manipulation and government disinformation. The victims of this persecution carried their trauma without support, their stories erased from history for years. But the Black Panthers were not the only revolutionary group to face systemic oppression. Another movement, just as powerful, would soon be silenced in the same brutal way. Chapter 34. The Bombing of the Black Town of Lakeview. In 1921, Lakeview, a thriving black community in Arkansas, was destroyed by a white mob, prompted by racial tensions and false accusations. The town's homes, businesses and schools were burned to the ground, and the residents were forced to flee. The destruction of Lakeview was overshadowed by larger historical events, and its victims were left to rebuild without help. For decades, the tragedy was ignored, and the survivors' voices went unheard. The community that had once thrived was erased from history. The survivors were left in the shadows, their grief unacknowledged, their story buried under the weight of racial hatred. But Lakeview wasn't the only black community to be destroyed in silence. Another town, wiped out in a similar manner, would soon have its story uncovered. But the pain still lingers. Chapter 35. The Forgotten Battle of Fort Pillow. In 1864, during the Civil War, Confederate forces massacred black Union soldiers at the Battle of Fort Pillow. Despite fighting bravely, the soldiers were killed after they had already surrendered. The massacre was swept under the rug, with many in the South denying its brutality, and the soldiers who died were left without recognition. The battle became a symbol of racial violence, but for decades it remained buried. The truth about the slaughter was ignored, and the pain of the survivors was silenced. The injustice of Fort Pillow lived on in the hearts of those who survived, but the rest of the world paid little attention to their suffering. But Fort Pillow was not the last massacre to be erased from history. Other battles where the fight for freedom was silenced by bloodshed would soon be forgotten as well. Chapter 36. The Tragedy of the Suffragists. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women across the world fought for their right to vote. Among them were the suffragists, who endured brutal opposition, mockery, and even imprisonment in their pursuit of equality. In Britain and the US, suffragists were subjected to violent tactics by the authorities. Many were force-fed during hunger strikes, while others were publicly humiliated and persecuted for daring to demand the right to vote. Yet, despite their courage, their sacrifices were largely ignored by history. While women in many countries eventually gained the right to vote, the suffragists' role in this monumental achievement was downplayed for decades. The suffrage movement was not just about votes, it was about the very recognition of women's voices and rights. But for years, the women who fought for these rights were overlooked. The suffragist stories were lost to time, their suffering minimised by the very societies they had worked to change. The fight for equality didn't stop with voting rights, and the suffragists' legacy was buried under layers of political resistance. But the suffragists weren't the only women whose struggles were erased from history. There was another group of women, whose sacrifices were just as great, but their voices were silenced even longer. Chapter 37. The Resettlement of Native Alaskans. In the mid-20th century, Native Alaskan communities were forcibly resettled by the US government. The goal was to modernise these indigenous people by moving them into urban centres, where they were stripped of their land, culture and traditions. Entire villages were relocated, tearing apart the social fabric that had existed for centuries. the forced resettlement decimated the way of life for many native Alaskans, leaving them disconnected from their ancestral lands and traditional practices. The emotional and physical toll was immense, but the government largely ignored the devastating consequences. The people of these communities were left to cope with trauma, isolation, and a loss of identity, with no assistance or compensation. For years, their suffering was erased from the national consciousness. Native Alaskans' cries for justice went unheard as their way of life was systematically destroyed. The erasure of their history remains one of the most painful chapters of American history, one that took decades to begin to acknowledge. But Alaska wasn't the only place where indigenous populations were displaced. Another nation, deeply committed to erasing indigenous peoples, would soon carry out an even more horrifying act of cultural destruction. Chapter 38: The Forgotten Holocaust of the Roma People. During World War II, the Roma people, often referred to as gypsies, were persecuted and murdered in large numbers by the Nazis. It is estimated that between 220,000 and 1.5 million Roma were killed in what is now recognised as the Porajmos, or the Roma Holocaust. However, their suffering was largely erased from history. The Holocaust narrative, which rightfully focused on the Jewish community's suffering, often ignored the Roma genocide. They were subjected to forced sterilizations, imprisonment, and execution. Yet the full scope of the atrocities committed against them remained largely hidden. For decades, the Roma people's pain was swept under the rug, their loss minimized by historical narratives that failed to include them. Even after the war, their suffering was dismissed, and they received no formal recognition or reparations. The Roma community, already marginalized for centuries, was left to mourn in silence, their trauma buried under layers of political neglect. But the Roma were not the only group targeted for annihilation. A similar tragedy had already been unfolding elsewhere in Europe, where another genocide went largely unnoticed by the world. Chapter 39: The Harlan County War. In the 1930s, the coal miners of Harlan County, Kentucky, were locked in a bitter battle with the coal companies who controlled their lives. The miners, many of whom were working in brutal conditions for little pay, fought for their right to unionize and gain better working conditions. The battle turned violent, with the companies using armed guards and local law enforcement to break up strikes. The miners faced brutal repression, including deadly shootouts and intimidation, but their struggles were largely ignored by the mainstream media. The lives lost, the families devastated by the violence, and the conditions in which they worked were minimized, overshadowed by the larger narrative of industrial progress. For years, the Harlan County War was relegated to a footnote in labor history. The workers' sacrifices were forgotten, and their pain was brushed aside by those in power. Even today, many of the miners who fought for justice remain unrecognized, their efforts lost to time. But the miners of Harlan County were not the only ones to face violent suppression in their fight for justice. Another group, in a different industry, would soon rise up against similar injustices, and their story was buried just as quickly. Chapter 40: The Forgotten Legacy of the Japanese American internment camps. During World War II, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated and interned in camps across the US under the guise of national security. Families were uprooted from their homes, their businesses were destroyed, and their freedom was stripped away. Many of them had no connection to Japan or its government, but were still treated as enemy aliens. Despite the widespread racism and injustice they faced, the victims of the internment camps were silenced for decades. They were forced to rebuild their lives without compensation, and their suffering was largely ignored by the government and society. It wasn't until the 1980s that the US government formally apologised and provided some restitution, but for many, it was too late. The emotional trauma, the loss of livelihoods, and the shame endured by Japanese Americans were buried for years, and the injustices of the internment camps remained a painful chapter in American history that was hidden for far too long. But the internment of Japanese Americans was not the only forced relocation carried out by the US government. Another, even more devastating displacement was about to be revealed, one that still echoes today. Chapter 41: The Uprising at Stonewall. In 1969, patrons at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, mostly LGBTQ+ individuals, fought back against a police raid. This spontaneous rebellion is now seen as the spark that ignited the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement. However, the struggle for LGBTQ+ rights was buried by mainstream society for decades, and those who stood up at Stonewall were often written out of the story. For years, LGBTQ+ individuals faced discrimination, criminalisation, and violence, yet their fight for equality was largely ignored. Stonewall was an act of defiance, but its importance was minimised in a society that preferred to silence the LGBT+ community. The movement was often overshadowed by other social and political causes, and the survivors of Stonewall struggled to see their impact recognised. For decades, the LGBTQ+ community's struggle for rights was hidden in the shadows, and Stonewall, while significant, remained a battle left unacknowledged by many. But Stonewall was just the beginning. Another fight for justice, this time involving women's rights, would soon rise to prominence, and its history would be erased just as quickly. Chapter 42. The Sacrifices of the Women in the French Resistance. During World War II, women played a vital role in the French resistance, risking their lives to fight against Nazi occupation. These women smuggled information, helped Jewish families escape, and carried out sabotage missions. Yet, after the war, their contributions were largely overlooked, and they were often treated as secondary to the male fighters. Many of the women in the resistance faced imprisonment, torture, and execution, but their sacrifices were forgotten once the war ended. The history of their bravery was buried under the heroism of the more visible male fighters, and for years, their stories went untold. The women who fought for freedom were silenced by history, and their efforts to resist Nazi tyranny were minimised for decades. The legacy of the French resistance, while celebrated in some circles, often failed to acknowledge the vital role of these women. But the women of the French resistance were not the only unsung heroes. Another group of women, fighting in an entirely different war, would soon have their contributions overlooked and buried by history. Chapter 43. The Lost Voices of the Civil Rights Movement. While figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks are celebrated in the history of the civil rights movement, many of the people who risked their lives for equality remained forgotten. These individuals, students, activists, and ordinary Black Americans, were often overshadowed by the more famous figures in the movement. But their voices were just as crucial in the fight for justice. Many of these unsung heroes were arrested, beaten, or killed, yet their stories were hidden from mainstream narratives. They gave everything for a cause they knew was right, but history often chose to ignore their contributions. Their sacrifices were buried under the larger narratives of the movement, leaving the true extent of their struggle unrecognised for years. The civil rights movement was not just about famous leaders, it was about the thousands of people who fought and died for freedom. But the civil rights movement wasn't the only battle for equality to be hidden from view. Another fight for justice, just as critical, was suppressed for far too long, and it would soon break free. Chapter 44. The Disaster of the 1906 San Francisco Earthquake. In 1906, a devastating earthquake struck San Francisco, causing widespread destruction and killing thousands. However, the recovery efforts were overshadowed by the sheer scale of the damage, and many victims, especially the poor and marginalised, were left without aid. The earthquake's immediate aftermath was chaotic. Fires ravaged the city, and the homeless were left to suffer in the ruins. Despite the catastrophic loss of life, the story of the marginalised victims was overshadowed by the city's push to rebuild and reclaim its former glory. Many of the poorest neighbourhoods, hit hardest by the quake, received little help. The survivors' pain was overshadowed by the city's desire to forget the destruction and move on quickly. The emotional and physical toll on the people who had lost everything went largely unacknowledged. But San Francisco wasn't the only city to suffer in silence after a natural disaster. Another, more devastating event was about to strike, and the world would again turn a blind eye. Chapter 45. The Fallout of the Korean War. The Korean War, fought from 1950 to 1953, left millions dead and millions more displaced. But the suffering didn't end when the war technically ended with an armistice. Families were torn apart, cities were destroyed, and the people of North and South Korea were left to deal with the fallout. What's often forgotten is the immense human cost that followed the war. The Korean people were left to pick up the pieces, but their pain went largely ignored by the world. Refugees, separated families, and the survivors of concentration camps were left without help. The war's true toll on the Korean people was overshadowed by the Cold War tensions that followed. For decades, the stories of those who lived through the war remained buried under the political aftermath. The devastation of the Korean War was minimized and the voices of those who survived went unheard. But the Korean War was far from the last global conflict to leave forgotten scars. Another war, with even deeper emotional wounds, would soon tear a generation apart, and their stories would be buried for decades. Final payoff. These 45 events may have been buried for decades, but the truth cannot remain hidden forever. The lives lost, the pain endured, and the communities destroyed by silence now demand to be remembered. For too long, history has erased the stories of those who suffered the most, but their voices are rising from the ashes. The price of silence is steep. Generations lost, injustices ignored, and wounds that never healed. Yet, as we uncover these forgotten truths, we begin to understand the profound cost of ignoring history. It's not just about remembering the past, it's about acknowledging the real human toll, the lives that were shattered, the sacrifices that were buried, and the dignity that was stolen. The truth has finally come to light, and it will not be silenced again. These stories, though forgotten for far too long, will now echo through history.